A presentation of the Public Affairs and Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with Research Specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. Well, we've got a lot of territory to cover today, Mae. So I think you mentioned something earlier to me about McCloskey.
Yes, well, people have asked Gloria who to write to about getting information, truth about the political assassinations to the American public. And we now have a candidate. Everybody listening has a candidate. I didn't know there was one. I said to write to anybody you want and tell them that you want some truth and some facts out about the Chappaquiddick accident, what's in the National Archives, the John Kennedy information, the Robert Kennedy trial, and all that, the Sirhan trial, the assassination down there, all the evidence. We want it all out on the table so that researchers can examine it. But yesterday's paper had a wonderful article. It said, McCloskey shifts from the war issue. Now, he's the first candidate. They've come out for a lot of different things and economic policies, so forth. Muskie was here in San Francisco this weekend, Santa Clara, talking about what he wanted. But here's McCloskey, who's saying that the Vietnam issue is not going to be the issue of the 72 campaign. In quote, pardon the campaign, the issue of truth in government is more important. The loss of faith in the administration pervades everything we do, and we must restore truth in government, and my campaign will raise that question. Now, we've quoted the man from La Mancha line that facts are the enemy of truth. So I would like to take on Mr. McCloskey and give him some facts and see if his campaign will still be truth, just like we want to meet Jack Anderson and put my facts against his investigators on his putting down the researchers of the assassinations. We'll write to McCloskey and tell him, Paul McCloskey, Representative Paul McCloskey from California, and say Mae Brussell appreciates the fact that you are going to run a campaign of truth in government. And she wants to meet with you, again, anytime, any place. And let's face some real truth, like who are you opposing? If you're running for president, who is your opponent? Did he get there by usurping the power? Let's find out really who you're opposing so you know how to run your campaign. That's the important issue. And I'll give you some facts and see if you're still running on truth or you're just another phony. Because all along since 1960 campaign in 64 and 68, I said that there were so many lies being thrown about that it wasn't worth getting out of bed in the morning to go to the polls at all. And certainly by 72, we'd either have a total police state, which is shifting that new vote of the Young Americans for Freedom down in Houston this week, nominating Spiro Agnew, is an entire show, which I would like to do next week if the assassination news isn't too heavy. Reading the letters of the men who have filtered the Young Americans for Freedom in the Texas area and came in, and their own wording, how they were to take over this group and be financed by the Texas oil people, the Texas conservatives. And by 72, it said it only takes a handful of people, 10 or 20, to rule the world. And the men who were going to take over the Young Americans for Freedom in the Texas area were compared themselves to Hitler and great conquerors. And they referred to John Kennedy in those days in the past tense as being dead, and he was still alive in these letters. These letters were going back and forth to Munich, Germany, and those were the men that I talked about on the program where he talked about the infiltration of the right-wing group. And they were not politically minded. They were ambitious young men who were doing this for kicks and were to take over this organization. And it's interesting this weekend that the man they want for president of the United States is Agnew, who I have linked the people that wanted him for our vice president in the first place with the people that overthrew Greece, the Pappas Foundation, the CIA Foundation. So I want to show that complete control of this country in 72 by that group. And if Representative McCloskey wants truth, I will give him facts. And he better not bandy the word truth around. We'll move along. But that was good news. Write to Representative McCloskey and say, what will you do about the current issue right now. If you don't want to go on the John Kennedy, just get down to Los Angeles, because we're going to do most of the show on what's happening in Los Angeles. And let's see, he's from California, so let him go right down there. That's his state. He's representing that state. So let him go to Los Angeles. Gloria, there was a book review in the New York Times this week. I got 4 books. I told you last week how much reading material came while I was away, and I got 4 new books to read. And I'll give you the titles, and also you write this down, this book title, and I'm going to give you 2 more books this week. I gave you 4. I know you haven't read them yet or bought them. I just know you haven't. You should have had one in your hands by now, but I'm going to give 3 more titles this week. Edward J. Epstein wrote a book called Inquest. It was one of the first books out in 1966 on, he charted out the amount of work the Warren Commission did and did not do, and questions the validity of this commission to come to an opinion. It's a totally schizophrenic book, because in the end he comes to the conclusion that Oswald did the murders, but 3/4 of the book is how the commission didn't do the work they were supposed to do. And if the first part is right, if he documents the meetings that they went to and didn't go to, then how could they come to that conclusion? So I throw out his conclusion, but when you take the documents which are there of what they didn't do, then you say you have to have another commission. Edward J. Epstein, Inquest. Another book that I want you to get, this new book, A Search for Justice. It's called A Search for Justice. And there's 3 writers, Squires, Ritter, and Hemphill, Hemphill, Hemphill. 3 gentlemen from Nashville, Tennessee, they were reporters, and they covered 3 trials in the United States, the Clay Shaw, James Ray, and Sirhan Sirhan case. And they were unrelated to each other. They didn't compare notes or anything about what they were doing, and they covered these 3 trials, and they came to the conclusion that the American justice system, if you could go by the political assassination trials, and this is what I'm trying to tell the American people, if I study those trials thoroughly, then I know there can be no justice in the lower courts for anybody. If you know your subject well, and it's interesting because these men have done it, they have covered the trials that I mentioned. And they came to the conclusion, each independently reached the conclusion that American justice works accidentally, if at all. None of them felt that they would have much confidence if their own chance of getting a fair trial were put to trial in the same courts or with the same judges. Now, this is what I've told you people, you don't stand a chance in court. If this is the way the justice system can work on a big case where all the eyes of the world are watching and you can analyze if you want, then nobody has a chance in court. And this is just what they're telling you. I say, if you say the assassination story, you understand that commissions don't work, that justice doesn't work. And somebody else far away in Tennessee that I don't know, these men have covered these trials and pulled together and give the evidence. The book review said they found the judicial system so lacking long overdue reform that the administration of justice is in serious trouble and often on a day-to-day basis. And it actually is inclined to thwart justice. And this is just what I was saying. In the case of James Ray, the journalist came away convinced that despite his guilty plea that he received, that there was a conspiracy, and questions of the April 4th, 1968 murder of Dr. King were never answered. If those were never answered, Spiro Agnew should not be vice president of the United States, and that's a strong statement, because he came in on the wave of the King killing. And if that conspiracy was done with the help of the FBI, which Harold Weisberg believes and knows, and all of us know, and it's written up in the book, Frame Up, but all of us know this, then the people who took advantage of that death, if they work with the FBI at all, should not be in those positions of power. And it says the administration of justice succeeds in punishing a guilty man because he was involved in a way. James Ray did have a part, but it made no pretense of initiating a search for truth or putting down what very may well have been a lie by Ray. The Sirhan shot they went on that killed Robert Kennedy in June '68 was viewed in front of many witnesses. But the only question at the time of the trial was his sanity. That was the only issue. And the authors contend that that prolonged $1 million trial made the sentence just as bad as if they had made a deal with the jury, that they bent the ear of the jury by saying he was insane with having this parade of psychiatrists and never having a cross-examination from other people. Now, we're going to go into the Sirhan thing because we're going to go right now to Evelyn Younger and the case in Los Angeles, because I begged the Los Angeles Police Department, Mayor Yorty, District Attorney Evelyn Younger, to let me come down and tell them there was a conspiracy, and they wouldn't let me. And they took Sirhan Sirhan and put him in $1 million box and brought him in a parade of psychiatrists. And at one point, Sirhan shook his head and said to his lawyer, they tried to say he was mentally deranged to a position where he couldn't plan what he was doing. And Sirhan made the remark, if I'm so deranged, why would they use me as an agent of the FBI or CIA? He said to his attorney. He laughed. If I'm that deranged, why did they use me? Now, this is common knowledge, see, that he made this kind of a remark. They thought, oh, he's kidding. He has delusions of grandeur. Well, this week you got a letter, didn't you, from Evelyn Younger, Gloria?
Yes, we did.
And he was defending himself and his position in Los Angeles?
Right. It says it was inevitable that the conspiracy theory would be suggested. That makes a better story. And then he goes on, he said, my answer, yes, definitely there was a conspiracy. When 65 witnesses testified concerning any incident, I am not disturbed concerning minor inconsistencies in the testimony. I would be concerned if all 65 witnesses testified in precisely the same manner. And, well, it's what we had mentioned before.
He wrote a letter to KLRB on the trial in Los Angeles, the Sirhan Sirhan trial. And he wrote the same letter all over the state, and he had in the Los Angeles Times editorial the same letter, dated August 18th, 1971. It came to KLRB August 19th, 1971, in which he said that when he prosecuted Sirhan, he knew that someday someone bring out the point of conspiracies. He said it was inevitable that they would because it makes a good story. And then he said, I know that some people whose motives might or might not be apparent would never let the case be put to rest. Well, my motive isn't what he thinks it is. I'm not making money, and I'm not a troublemaker. We've gone into that. I want facts, and facts will bring what I indicate is truth. He said he was still asked about inconsistencies in the trial. I'm going to read a few of them in a minute, inconsistencies. But he's not disturbed because a few witnesses, he says, when you have 65 people testifying, you will get inconsistencies, and they can be evaluated by the jury. The jury was only allowed to hear the witnesses that Mr. Younger allowed to be called, so that you wouldn't even get many inconsistencies if the witnesses are selected for the jury. Then the jury only heard minor inconsistencies. Is what the jury didn't hear. The people that could have been brought in, or in my research, the witnesses not called, would have blown the jury's mind. It would have thrown the case out. But as long as the witnesses are selected by the persons involved in a crime, then the jury only hears the ones that they want them to hear. Now, it should say that he went on in his letter, and he said that this investigation was one of the most complete, if not the most complete, criminal investigation ever conducted by a law enforcement agency in the United States. Now, if what he's saying is true, then that book on American justice just has to be about the most valid book in the world, that nobody stands a chance of a fair trial. Because if that was the most complete investigation in the United States, heaven help any person who's on trial on a murder charge. In this article in the LA Times, in the letter you have at the studio, he says all possible information was made available. 4,000 witnesses were interviewed. 65 were called before the district attorney's office to testify. Out of 4,000, 65 testified. He had many files on the case, and that is in that letter. Now, when the murder of Robert Kennedy took place, the Los Angeles Times had an article. The murder was in June 68. In July 14th, 1968, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times that says 23-man task force was selected to probe Kennedy's murder. A select team, handpicked for their skills, will go into the murder investigation. Plus men, now, and I'm sorry to quote from it to put this in, that you're thinking in terms of a CIA or military takeover because you want to remove Robert Kennedy, like you already know the research on the John Kennedy murder. So we're going back to the Los Angeles Police Department, and District Attorney Edward Young has decided that he will have military connections because men in the past will investigate this who have developed military connections in the two continents. And the 23 task man force will go into the political underground and so forth. The boss is Younger's top aide, Chief Deputy District Attorney Lynn Compton, a one-time UCLA football hero, is going to head the investigation. Men were drawn from all the police divisions, non-detective specialized skills, and so forth. There was a talk of going to European and Asian connections because of a conspiracy theory. Since the fatal shooting 9 days ago, investigators have said that available evidence indicate it was the work of one man. It was very important. Younger said that no lead, this is what caught my fancy. Younger said no lead, no piece of evidence, no matter how kooky, will be overlooked. If there are 10,000 leads, we checked out 900, if we checked out 9,999 and let one go, someone would write a book accusing us of covering up something. Unimportant leads that might be ignored in other cases will be checked out. We would not want to invite someone like New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison to come in 4 years later and say, we didn't do this, we didn't do that. We are aware that this is not just another criminal case. We are aware the whole nation, the whole world is watching, and we will proceed. Well, at that point, I got on the telephone and I called the Los Angeles Police Department. Sergeant Paget, Sergeant Collins were in charge of this task force. And I said, are you ready for me? I'm coming to Los Angeles. I've worked on the John Kennedy murder, and I will be there. At the time of the murder of Robert Kennedy, Mayor Yorty got on the radio and television and held a diary of Sirhan's and told the nation that Sirhan Sirhan was a communist. And I know the front stories of the CIA and how they work, and I didn't realize the role Mayor Yorty was playing, so I called him on the telephone and talked to his secretary and said, Mayor Yorty shouldn't dangle that diary around because he's being used. It's a cover story. There are too many indications. You remember, Gloria, that 6 days before this murder, I put a letter. I said this on the program for those who didn't hear programs before who are new. I put a letter in the hands of Rose Kennedy at the Mark Thomas Inn in Monterey, California, dated May 28th, when she was here, that Robert Kennedy was going to be killed. And I knew he would, and how and why. So 6 days later, when Mayor Yorty is holding this big communist smokescreen in Los Angeles, the cover story, like they used in the Oswald thing, I felt free on the basis of knowing how this would happen to say, look, you're repeating the Dallas, and I didn't realize then that Los Angeles was like Dallas. You're being used. I didn't think he was part of it then. I do now, but I said, you're being used. So I told him to put the diary away. So I have a letter I brought in the studio today, Gloria, that I took out of my files. I've written to public officials since 1963. It's dated July the 5th, 1968. And this is the one that I sent to Mr. Younger. It said, Dear Mr. Younger, he was the District Attorney of Los Angeles, the Attorney General of your state right now. I read in the Los Angeles Times, June 14th, that you have appointed a 23-man task force to take information regarding the associations and contacts of Sirhan Sirhan with regards to the murder of Robert Kennedy. You may not want another Garrison to appear 4 years later, but for your information, Jim Garrison gave the FBI information about David Ferrie immediately in November 1963 and he was released without investigation. Jim Garrison, we said, was on the case right away, and here was Mae Brussell on the case right away. My background and research on the John Kennedy assassination allows me to speak with you about the Sirhan case, and I went into the volumes I had cross-filed, the years I had spent, my research on the murder of John Kennedy. Back to Sirhan Sirhan, I said. Sergeant Paget and Sergeant Collins called me this week because I had called Mayor Yorty's office, and the message I gave the mayor was to keep quiet about the diary and the communist associations, because whatever notes were given to the police by that family were written and planted by the Central Intelligence Agencies for purpose of throwing the evidence into every direction except the true motive. After 1 month of collecting evidence, even with the tight lid you thought you could put upon the public, I have enough idea of how the Sirhan family operated and their contacts and where they received their money, how they worked, that I can sit and present this case to you. The men asked me to write you a letter with factual and documented material. I went into the fact that famous spies like Hemphill or Gary Powers with the U-2 can be the most famous agents in the world, and I can't bring documents in showing what they did. I can bring information, but nobody had documents. They don't leave documents around. I go into the case of Hemphill and Gary Powers. How many factual documents do you want me to bring to Los Angeles? I said, I will come to Los Angeles to see you any day during the month of July. I was going on vacation in August. I want to see you and as many of the men of the 23 Task Force as possible. Sergeant Paget and Sergeant Collins told me on the telephone there is no such body in fact exists, like it said in the newspaper, and they are the men gathering evidence. And they also told me that all evidence of a plot or conspiracy is being sent to your office, and that it is massive, and the police will not be accused of being a branch of the Dallas force. At some time in American history, you legal men are going to have to meet your responsibility to all the people of this nation, and not the ones above who are giving you the orders. My work is prepared, and I am waiting to hear from you. Sincerely, Mae Brussell. That is to Evel Younger, dated July 1968.
Did you get a reply?
I never got a reply. I told you I got a telephone call about 2 weeks later. I have the date at home. Are you Magnan Brussell? That was my maiden name. They didn't know whether I was Mr. and Mrs. because the May that I write probably looked like an MR and MRS. Yes, I'm Magnan Brussell. This is the police department in Los Angeles. Fine. I thought they wanted to set a date with me. I said, how much do you weigh? What color is your hair? What nationality are you? I gave them the information, and we hung up, and they compared it, I guess, to the same Magnan Brussell who was doing research on the John Kennedy and believed it was the same person, and it went into their files. I never heard from them again. Now we'll go to Los Angeles, because what Mr. Younger is telling you, I wrote a letter to Buff Cody in Salinas and to Representative Burt Talcott, because Mr. Talcott, before he went to Europe, had shown an interest in these programs while I was in Washington, and he'll be out here on the coast. I do want to see him. And I wrote a letter to Burt Talcott's office this week when Mr. Younger sent out his defense of his conspiratorial put down, and I said, I hope you do not interpret this as a gentleman's agreement, and you all know what that term is if you lived through the 40s or 50s. It's an under-table way of saying you don't have to believe all this. We've gone into it. There's always kooks with other motives. I wrote, I do not want you to take this as a gentleman's agreement that it will not be necessary to meet with me when Mr. Talcott comes out here, because let Mr. Evel Younger, who's named in a lawsuit in Los Angeles regarding this conspiracy, be decided by the jury to be guilty or innocent. It is not for him to say nothing happened now because he's named in a legal suit. Let him clear it with the jury. And, he's like Clay Shaw going around saying, I'm innocent, but it took the federal government to stop the trial. Let the jury decide. That's what it's all about in America. And I feel if Evel Younger wants to tell everybody, don't believe all this talk. Let the evidence, let's stick with the facts, and if a man is named in a suit, let's listen to the facts and get both sides. Now, I'm going to keep you up to date because when we went on this show, Gloria, at the end of June, the AP wire, the UP wires had nothing about the evidence in the Sirhan case in Los Angeles, remember? And we broke on the wave of a thing that now is carried all the way. The New York Times finally had a 4-inch article about the evidence there, but more will be coming out because I made a very broad blanket statement when Barbara Blair challenged the appointment of Dean Wayne Wolfer as criminologist in Los Angeles. I made a statement there's no way out of this for the Los Angeles Police Department or Mr. Evel Younger or the FBI. If the people will keep the interest going, the evidence will show you how trials work and how conspiracies work right in our own state, so we don't have to go back 7 years and pound the doors of the National Archives. We can work in the state of California, which affects our laws and lives. Well, now, the Los Angeles Times had a news blackout for a whole year. It was in their city. I told you they didn't even carry the story of the polka dot dress girl that was killed. But they did have a long 4-page article, and it carries so much evidence that we're talking about that I'm going to read a lot of it to you now. And the headline article was, Sirhan case, was there a second gunman? This is as of September 1971. This is what's happening in Los Angeles. Gun tampering inquiry may have bearing on the Kennedy killing theory. Last May 28th, Barbara Blair accused criminalist D. Wayne Wolfer of errors and violations and procedures in the ballistic evidence of 3 major murder cases in Los Angeles in which 3 men were awaiting execution. And she raised the question of whether a second gunman killed Robert Kennedy. She asserted that Mr. Wolfer, who was up for appointment to become head criminalist in Los Angeles, should have this position because evidence, she said, that he had broken 4 standard precepts or procedures in investigating Kennedy's death, but he also tampered with other witnesses and evidence in the murder of 2 people in Los Angeles, one named Doyle Terry, and the other was Deputy District Attorney Jack Kershke. Now, this is very interesting, and the quote here in the Los Angeles Times, when Sirhan Sirhan was arrested, he was taken into the jail, and it was 2 in the morning, and they said, how long have you been in this country? He didn't answer. Do you speak English? He didn't answer. How much do you weigh? No reply. He spoke up and said, these handcuffs are too tight, and I'm thirsty, and then he shut up. Are you married? He didn't answer. Do you have a family? No answer. Did the detectives tell you to be silent? No answer. Do you speak English? No answer. Can you talk? No answer. What's your name? No answer. Who are you? No answer. Are you ashamed of what you've done? Answer. Hell no, he answered. Then the police went out of the room, and they came back, and the district attorney's office, a man by the name of Murphy, was in the room with him. And Sirhan said to George Murphy, not this ex-senator, but the district attorney man, how long have you been with the DA's office? And Murphy answered, 3 years. I was a policeman, and I retired, and I've been 3 years with the district attorney's office. And Sirhan said, do you remember Kershke, being Jack Kershke? And the DA says, very well. He was convicted of killing his wife and lover. Now, Robert Blair Kaiser, who writes in his book, RFK Must Die, makes an observation, a writer's observation, that the prisoner, Sirhan Sirhan, was very curious about Kershke. And Murphy's answer to him was, well, it was a hard case to follow, and we'll talk about it later. And then he said, Sirhan, did you read about it? Where did you know about it? We'll talk about it. This was 2:20 in the morning. It's just about 2 hours since Robert Kennedy was killed. They went to another room, had a little press conference, and Sirhan was there, and he wouldn't talk. It was 3:15 in the morning, and it was the interrogation room. And they called in some other persons from the DA's office, and then Sirhan motioned to them, come over here. He wanted to talk, and they thought this was the break they wanted. And he got the public officials around, and all he said was, I want to talk about Jack Kershke. And they didn't know why he wanted to do it. And he talked about Kershke's death penalty, how you reduce a death penalty to life in prison, what are the technicalities of the Kershke case. Now, this was a very peculiar behavior, Robert Kaiser said, that the prisoner was settling down and enjoying, I'm quoting Bob Kaiser, the prisoner was settling down and enjoying the situation as much as he could. And it was 3:25 in the morning. They didn't know his name. They didn't know anything about him. He had just 3 hours before shot Robert Kennedy, and he wanted to talk on a philosophical discussion of crime and punishment. Robert Kaiser observed it was appropriate, and it was inappropriate. Now, it seems that the tampering of the evidence in the Jack Kershke case reduced the Kershke penalty from death penalty to life, and in Sirhan's case, Sirhan knew something about the district attorney's office before the guns went off. He had a word or blackmail. It was a magic word. And every time they say, what's your name? He says, Jack Kershke. So that as you look back in the trial in Los Angeles now, the same district attorney that fouled up the evidence that gave Kershke and Sirhan the death penalty is so mishandled that they're going to get life, and then probably they'll get out. But Sirhan knew something from the time that he was arrested, and the only word he'd used for hours was Jack Kershke. Now, back to the Los Angeles article. On June the 1st, Chief of Police Edward Davis, who also named in a trial as a defendant in this trial in Los Angeles that we're going into, dismissed Barbara Blair's vendetta against Wolfer. She didn't want him head criminologist in Los Angeles, and Chief of Police Davis said, in my estimation, he's the top expert in the country. end quotes. Now, Evelyn Younger says this was the top investigative trial in the agency, and the chief of police in Los Angeles, Dave Wolfer, is the top. If these are the top people in the country should have a complete overhaul of the whole judicial system. In their opinion, second largest city in the United States outside of New York, if the chief of police says that this criminologist is the head man in the whole country, then the whole country is sick, sick, sick. Back to the quotes. On June the 1st, the chief of police dismissed this suit. And you want to do it?
Go ahead.
Okay. And then on June the 4th, he called back the news people and said, we have to have 4 more days to investigate this. They thought it was a verbal or clerical error. And he called back on June the 4th, a press conference said they'd have to go into Mrs. Blair's claims a little further.
You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell. This is KLRB Stereo FM Carmel by the Sea.
June the 4th, the Los Angeles Police Department said that they would have to probe the charges of Mrs. Blair. May 28th, she made her accusations against the criminals in the police department. June 1st, she was put down. On June 4th, they announced that they would have to probe, and they would need 2 weeks to see if evidence was tampered, like she said it was tampered. And on June 24th, the chief of police in Los Angeles postponed again an announcement on what happened with the tampering of evidence in these murders, and she particularly is talking about the Sirhan Sirhan. They postponed it to July the 6th. But July the 2nd, the chief investigators in Los Angeles again postponed a news conference, and this time they said we'll have to do it indefinitely. I told you there was a blackout down there. And when they were pressed for an explanation of why this was put off indefinitely from May the 28th, now July the 2nd, they said that their office was terribly concerned that evidence in the Sirhan trial, the fatal bullets and the murder weapon, were tampered with. And they couldn't finish the investigation of Mrs. Blair's charges until they probed further into the crucial exhibits that were contaminated, and to what degree they were contaminated. Well, last Wednesday, this is in August, they announced that they'd have to have a grand jury investigation. And the grand jury, they said there is evidence that the exhibits were so carelessly handled by the county clerk's office that they would be useless in future court action for Sirhan's appeal of the death sentence. They would also be useless in determining the truth or falsity of her allegations, which imply then that a second gunman may have been Kennedy's real murderer because the other gun has been thrown away, and that Sirhan has been condemned for killing somebody that he maybe didn't murder. So Wolfer, who was expected by July 1st to have his appointment as head of the crime lab, has filed a suit against Miss Blair, but the thing was at a standoff. In the meanwhile, County Clerk William Sharp, whose office was accused by Bush of ignoring the orders to not allow anyone to see this evidence, has information that 13 unauthorized persons were in to see the murder evidence, the bullet, and the guns. The Blair case remains a standoff for more than 2 months. I'm reading the Los Angeles Times, when they expected to lay it to rest. But in a sense, the Blair-Wolfer controversy is merely a salad, while the entree involves deeper questions in themselves, not touched by Mrs. Blair, but voiced by at least 2 John Does with her in the suit. Mrs. Blair claims that the private ballistic investigation of criminalist William Harper of Pasadena, he's been there for 35 years, he's worked on local trials, and his work served to support a court action. This is the suit that I talked about with the Chief of Police Davis and our Attorney General of the state. This work supports a court action that directly tackles the second gunman theory. The suit was laid on June 25th by Godfrey Isaac on behalf of a freelance writer, Theodore Chirac. He charges that city officials deliberately suppressed certain evidence in the Kennedy slaying and covered up inadequacies in the original investigation. The Times has learned that ever since the question of possible tampering with the Kennedy evidence, they have continued to question persons who had nothing to do with the exhibits or the evidence. Some of these names were brought into the Kennedy case by Chirac, who for 3 years told another version of the events of 1968. And I'm going on with the Los Angeles Times article, but I want to say something at this point. Remember that Evel Younger is saying there was a difference between witnesses before the jury whose stories, maybe some of them, weren't exactly right. I'm talking about people that never were heard before the jury. Now, we're going into the John Does. There was another version on June 5th, 1968. One is former KNXT television newsman Donald Shulman, who witnessed Kennedy's assassination and told of seeing another person fire a weapon in the pantry, but who, oddly, was briefly questioned only once in the month leading to the Sirhan trial and was never called as a witness. Now, these end quotes for 1 minute. This is serious because we have been told in the state of California that this 23-man force would seat 10,000 people if necessary. And here's a man for 3 years who saw somebody pull a gun and wanted to be called and was not called as a witness. I'm going back to the Los Angeles article now. Quotes, his first intensive interview with any investigative agency was July 23rd of this year. Another belated witness was Chirac, who told the Times, if it's true the district attorney can't make decisions on the Blair thing until this tampering is questioned, why are they still following this other track? The whole thing is tampering is a red herring. It is Chirac who 3 years ago began a personal crusade that led to the present investigation tangle over what to most people they thought was an open and shut political murder case. Chirac, a native of Winnipeg, said that they overlooked a second gunman who actually fired the fatal bullet using Sirhan's first 2 pistol shots as the cover for his own fire. The nation was tired of conspiracy theories on the wake of Garrison and the John Kennedy assassination, and they were glad to have the story they dismissed as another new breed of conspiratorial demonologists who were sincere but misguided. See, this is how I was put down when I said there was a conspiracy. Chirac admits that he gets emotional and even obsessive, but he says, look, I'm proud of my work and I want the truth to come out, whatever it is. The American people aren't going to get anything more than the official version until a few more questions are asked, and asked by the right people, people influential enough to demand the answers. On June the 4th, 1968, Chirac was a freelance writer writing a documentary on the Kennedy campaign, and he was following his victory speech, and he went through the crowded ballroom, and it was swamped, and he was crushed behind the podium, and he was outside the pantry, and there was a little popping noise. It sounded like firecrackers. And then a security guard slipped out the swinging doors to keep the ballroom crowd from bursting into the bloody pantry. And in the chaotic hours following the shooting, Shulman, now 28, the newsman from KNXT, was quoted as saying he saw a security guard fire his weapon. The newscaster, Jerry Dunny, broadcast that Shulman told him Kennedy's bodyguards fired back the suspect and he was shot in the leg. Shulman's account was carried worldwide by the United Press at the time. He repeated his interview with Jeff Brent, general manager of Continental News Service. A week later, he told his story to the police, and it was never followed up. You can imagine Mae Brussell calling from Carmel, California. I'm going off the quote now for a minute, Gloria. Calling from Carmel and saying, look, there's a conspiracy down there. I want to tell you who did it. Here's a man in the Ambassador Hotel who sees somebody shoot Robert Kennedy from the back of the head, and he's not called as a witness. How frustrating it would be to live in Los Angeles and be in the Ambassador and see it and have a trial and see the police department for 3 years cover this up, and then see the man who covered up become the Attorney General of the state of California and scream law and order to the hippies and the communes and the kids, and the radicals at Stanford and Berkeley, when he had all of this, and the police told me he was carrying all this evidence of conspiracy in his office. How frustrating to be in the Ambassador and see someone shoot Robert Kennedy and not be allowed to be called as a witness. And I'm writing a letter here. They won't let me. You imagine how Mr. Shulman felt. Back to the Los Angeles Times. About a week later, he told his story, and it was never followed up. From that day until July 23rd, 1971, Shulman was never heard publicly again. But Chirac found him. And Chirac, because he was the ambassador that night, Chirac found him, and he talked to Brent, and he traced down Shulman, who evidently then believed that the bodyguard who fired at Sirhan, was firing at Sirhan rather at Kennedy. At the time, they thought the bodyguard was shooting back. But Chirac also talked with Carl Euchre, the ambassador maitre d', who was leading Kennedy, his left hand through his right, through the narrow pantry. And Euchre insists to this day that Sirhan fired his first 2 shots from Euchre's right side and in front of Kennedy, and that he got Sirhan in a tight headlock after the second shot. And Sirhan never got near enough to Kennedy to inflict the near point-blank, upward-traveling, back-to-front head wound that killed him. And this confirms the autopsy of Noguchi, 1 inch from the back of the head. In Sirhan's trial, the jury was told that Euchre probably miscounted. You see, there were about 8 bullets around there, stopping Sirhan after the 4th. Euchre says today he was not mistaken, that Sirhan was captive after the 2nd shot and too far away in any case on the first 2. Then Chirac went after the bodyguard. Kennedy, a fatalist about possible danger, traveled with one professional security man, William Barry, a close friend and former FBI. Now I'm ending the quote here to make a comment, Gloria. In Robert Kaiser's book, RFK Must Die, he makes a very innocent remark, and this is why I'm anxious for Kaiser to come out next week to talk about conspiracies. Kaiser goes into the 2 men hired to guard Robert Kennedy, and one of them was William Barry. Now, the night they went from the pantry into the room to speak to the people, Ethel Kennedy, not conspiratorial mind and certainly not knowing that they would be killed, but always cautious, noted that Barry, who was to protect Robert Kennedy, wasn't with Robert Kennedy at all. He was to be in front of him and protect him. He's an ex-FBI man. And Ethel Kennedy said to him, according to Robert Kaiser, and it was an innocent comment of Kaiser's, but I picked it up immediately, Barry, you're not to be with me. You're supposed to be guarding Robert. He was behind the lines holding the arm of Ethel. And Ethel, sensing evidently a danger because he's not guarding her husband at all, said, don't take my arm. You're up there with Bob. And when the guns get off, Barry was with Ethel. He was not with Robert Kennedy. And this is what my observation, why was Barry not front man with Bobby? And because he's FBI, I have to see what position he's anyway, because I suspect this particular organization, and with good reason. The Los Angeles Times goes on that Robert Barry was one professional security man. Mae's saying he was with Ethel, he wasn't with Bob. Then they say, to protect itself, the ambassador hired extra guards on its own that night from the Ace Guard Service. There were 7 men moonlighting after their daytime jobs who provided their own uniforms, insignia, and sidearms, end quote. Interrupt. I tell you that the man who's named in the suit down in Los Angeles that killed Robert Kennedy, a Mr. Caesar, was hired by the Ace Guard Service. This is what the LA Times is saying. That this man also was a plumber at Lockheed. He worked at Lockheed Aircraft. And in my cross-filing system, anyone who's involved in any of these assassinations that is employed in government positions like that, they call him a maintenance man. The maintenance man at Lockheed. Can you just see him fixing the tools and pipes and cars and, various things, and then say, oh, you are the man in charge of the life of Senator Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. The maintenance man from Lockheed came home and arrived about 5 minutes late, and there was a message at the home. He was totally breathless. Get on up there tonight. You're going to moonlight at the ambassador. It seems to me that any guard that would be guarding Robert Kennedy at that point should have been hired just about a week ago, because the victory night, or even the defeat night if he didn't win it, he would be in there with a group of people at a set place at a set time, because you have to hire the rooms and rent them, and you know whether he's going to be at the Hilton in Beverly Hills or the Beverly Hills Hotel, the ambassador. So if he has a guard, it doesn't seem you hire him at 6 o'clock that night and say, get on over there, boy, at 8 o'clock. He's come home, and his wife says there's a message, you're to be responsible for the life of Senator Kennedy tonight, after being the maintenance man all day. Okay, we won't have time. I go in these side stories, but I have to interpret the LA Times is telling you something. And then the quote goes on. Then Chirac went after the bodyguard, this particular body. He goes into the bodyguards. One was assigned in the pantry and was outside the swinging doors, and when Euchre and Kennedy burst in, the guard fell in with them, and behind Euchre and Kennedy and slightly to the right, where the bullet was to come later. In the days following Kennedy's death, the guard was interviewed by the police and FBI, and he said that when the shooting began, he was knocked down backwards. This is the guard for Robert Kennedy. When the gun went off, he fell down on the floor, and he never saw the gunman's face or anything about him. But he said he never saw the gunman's face, only an arm and a pistol. But his account conflicted slightly every time on the point of whether he went with his gun or actually ever got it out of the holster. Once he said he drew his gun. Another time he said, I reached for mine and it was too late. And one official noted, that guy's story doesn't jive. He tells conflicting accounts, and it seems obvious he hadn't really seen anything, and he really had nothing to tell us. And because of the variances in the guard's story, they dropped any further questioning. His credibility was questioned by officials who felt that he was trying to inject himself into a sensational case and really knew little about it. There is no record or any effort made or any thought entertained to determine whether those variances came from his effort to conceal something rather than his just fabricating, and his gun was never examined, and the subject never came up in Los Angeles. The fact that he gave so many discrepancies wasn't reason to examine him. Evelyn Younger threw him out, and Chief of Police Davis and Evelyn Younger tell you this was the most inclusive study in justice that was ever done in the United States. Whatever might be said of this, in the light of the present controversy 3 years later, it should be remembered that Sirhan, after all, had been captured on the very act of firing, and the days and weeks after his capture, there was no substantial evidence that he was anything but a loner, bent on motives solely his own. Now, the Los Angeles Times says in the first days after his capture, there was no evidence. Jerry Cohn, writing for the Los Angeles Times, says there was no evidence of the motives. I called Jerry Cohn at the Los Angeles Times, who was covering this thing, and said, I want to talk to you as a researcher. And he put me off. Everybody who comes with evidence, they put them off. They don't want you to tell them. So Jerry Cohn can write now in 1971 and tell you that at that time there wasn't any other problems or questions. When I call him, he wouldn't see me, and he hasn't seen me on any of these cases. Back to the article, it says, in the investigation, Special Unit Senator, Chief of Detectives Robert Yoten wrote about the event and said, in July 1969, I held a Special Unit Senator meeting asking 10 questions to the absolute possibility of any person with right-wing connections being in the kitchen or pantry. This is the Chief of Detectives in Los Angeles investigating, and asked if there was any chance that anyone with right-wing connections was in the pantry, and within a week all of them had been answered satisfactorily. Yoten concedes today, but says he does not believe that his information may have been incomplete, but he certainly missed one, and that was a security guard who was dismissed and forgotten long before the case. Now, in the case of the security guard, Chirac found him living in San Fernando Valley a year later, and he made no bones about his political belief. He said he supported Governor Wallace from Alabama for president. He hated the Kennedy family, and he hated black people, and a black race war was imminent. This is what he's saying. And the Chief of Detectives is telling you none of these people were in the ambassador at that time. The guard said he did have a .22 caliber pistol the night that Sirhan was shot, and later he said he sold the gun to a friend. He said he had drawn his gun that night, but he was only acting out his motions. Chirac was convinced that the whole story had not been told about the night that Kennedy died, and he began to document his findings in an alternate theory of the assassination, collaborating with French journalist Gerard Auchan in a documentary movie called Who Killed Robert Kennedy. And nearly a year, his theory was dismissed as a fabric of coincidence and stretched possibility, and the public officials refused to give him any kind of an interview. In July 1970, Chirac put his theory before Grant Cooper, who was the counsel for Sirhan Sirhan, and referred to the ballistic expert Harper, who he knew professionally for years. And they passed on an informal checking of the ballistic information, talking about what came up at the time of the trial. Mr. Harper, who lives in Pasadena and has worked on these many cases, had begun his work after he read Robert Yoten's book on the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and he noticed apparent inconsistencies over a slug too large to have come from Sirhan's small revolver. Now, I'm going to end that quote for 1 minute, Gloria, to tell you that we're getting into ballistics now, and we're going to go back to the letter of Everett Younger, the Attorney General of the state, that says a few witnesses disagreed with each other. Here is this ballistic man in Pasadena doing his work, and this is why these blanket defenses of themselves in those departments won't work anymore. Mr. Harper said that this slug did not fit Sirhan's revolver. In the first of what was many visits to the criminal exhibit section of the county clerk's office, Harper found that the large slug was a merely flattened .22 bullet, and he found other things. And after many months of testing and weighing and micrographing and comparing the actual bullets with the test slugs fired later by Wolfer, as studying coroner Thomas Noguchi's massive autopsy report on Mr. Kennedy, Harper developed these essential criticisms of Wolfer's work, and hence this was the foundation of this is what he found as the stone of the official investigation. At least 2 of the bullets removed from the pantry, one from Kennedy's body and one from ABC newsman William Weisel, do not match each other and could not have been fired by the same gun. Bullets from the same gun will have matching individual characteristics, while bullets from 2 guns of the same make will match only in class characteristics. And the absence on the tool bullets of any phase marks, usually the investigator initials, and serves as guideposts to line them up, and these do not match. He said there is a difference of 14% in the rifling angles of the 2 bullets, again pointing to the conclusion they came from different guns. Then he goes on to the 3rd point. While the bullets don't match each other, neither does either one match any of the 3 bullets contained in an envelope, Exhibit 55, that purports to contain 3 test bullets fired from Sirhan's gun after his arrest. The serial number was given H18602. The serial number of Sirhan's gun was H53725. Wolfer later explained that the second gun, H18602, was borrowed from the county clerk's criminal evidence section from a group of guns stated that were planned to be destroyed as old evidence weapons, and Wolfer said he borrowed it. Dwayne Wolfer, the criminalist at the trial of Sirhan Sirhan, used the gun that was later to be thrown away, and in the trial, he said he borrowed it on June 10, 1968, at the time when Sirhan's gun was before the grand jury, and it wasn't accessible to him without a court order. But the evidence slip on Exhibit 55, containing 3 bullets fired from it, states in Wolfer's handwriting that H18602 was test-fired June 6, the very day that Kennedy died, and Sirhan's gun did not come before a grand jury exhibit until June the 7th. There actually are no test bullets in evidence fired from Sirhan's own gun, registered H53725, only the test slugs that have now, from the now destroyed borrowed gun. Now, Mr. Harper claims at the Sirhan trial it was concluded that Union leader Paul Schrade, who was behind Kennedy, was hit in the forehead by a bullet that went through the shoulder pad of Kennedy's coat. That would have been a westbound shot from in front of the 2 men. The lab analysis of Kennedy's coat revealed that the hole through the shoulder pad was a back-to-front eastbound shot, as Wolfer himself testified, with the bullet lodging in the ceiling and never recovered. Weighing of the remaining bullet fragments taken from Kennedy and the 5 wounded accounts satisfy 8 separate bullets, as many as Sirhan's gun could have fired, but leave out a possible 9th that is unrecovered eastbound bullet that went through Kennedy's shoulder pad. The implications of Harper's investigation are unsettling to law enforcement officials who sincerely believed that they had an airtight prosecution signed, sealed, and delivered in the Kennedy case with none of the nagging questions that attended the Garrison probe of President Kennedy's death. But Harper's work, individually, as a criminologist, as a gun expert, was gratifying to Chirac because after 2 years he found himself regarded as a crank, and now to support his theory with the scientific support. I'm going on to finish this quotation, but I want to say that I don't mind being called a crank by these people because scientific evidence will back all of us. It just boomerangs to them. They'll look sillier as time goes on. One more paragraph here from the Los Angeles Times. Harper wrote to Mr. Chirac, multiple gun shootings are not a rarity in police work. The capture of Sirhan with his gun at the scene resulted in a total mesmerization of the investigative effort. The well-established teachings of criminalistics and forensic pathology were cast aside and bypassed because it was expedient solution and an erroneous oversimplification. We're going to go into Ruby shooting Oswald. I think Oswald also was shot from the back because of the autopsy, and we've gone into either it's the second Oswald that was killed or Ruby, who claims he didn't kill him, shot from the front too, and Oswald was shot from the back but to make sure he was dead by the other police department. We'll go into his autopsy, Oswald's autopsy, because scientists have gone into that too. And it doesn't look like those. You get a gunman in front like Ruby and Sirhan, and they shoot too, and then you say, wow, they did it. And the police department says, well, you all saw it. I mean, 100 million people saw it. How can you deny? And in Los Angeles, they're saying there was an expedient solution, oversimplification. And now they have this suit going on that will continue to go, and they're pressing for an investigation. And Mr. Chirac and Mr. Harper will work very hard to get the appeal of Sirhan, and Godfrey Isaac has gone to be the attorney of Sirhan Sirhan now because his original attorney, Luke McKissick, didn't go along for a whole year on this. And Sirhan has taken on Godfrey Isaac as his attorney, so McKissick refuses to be fired, so now they have two. Mrs. Blair's attack on Wolfer remains in limbo. He has not been appointed head of the criminology department in Los Angeles yet. It is shadowed by a grand jury investigation into the tampering of the evidence. The exhibits are badly messed up. Further investigation is almost impossible. And the grand jury just last week said, we don't know if we'll get the truth. There is so much tampering. Now the bullet, the coat of Robert Kennedy, pages from Sirhan diary have been ripped off. We're going to the grand jury met since this article was out. And they're scolding the bookkeepers down there for ripping out pages of the diary, tampering with Robert Kennedy's clothes. The gun is missing. The bullets are tampered with. That is a long hour. I think we have to sometimes spend 1 hour and not jump around to go into something, because as we get more scholarly and academic on one subject, Gloria, then we can go 1 hour on Chappaquiddick maybe and one on Manson. And you barely touched the subject, but I think everyone listening should appreciate some of these facts and keep getting your pencil for next week and try hard to understand what's happening.
Right. We only got through half of what we had planned to do this morning, but that's something that should, I think, be brought up, the article in the Times.
Yeah.
And you did want to read 70 hours and 30 minutes, but
next week we'll do
yes.
that.
It's just we're out of time
during the week. I
Right.
would love to read that book to people who don't have it. I think they'd enjoy it.
I would love to read it. All right, Mae, well, we'll be back again next week at this time and try to finish what we started this morning. It's marvelous. Thank you.